So I wanted to talk to you about economic development today to sort of give you a sense of where I think we are and where we are failing and perhaps why we are failing, and to have a discussion about that. I think it would go without saying that Syracuse and Onondaga County could be doing better in terms of economic development. I think all of us would say that where we are is not meeting the expectations of our community. But others have said very, very bluntly that Syracuse and Onondaga County should be attractive to investment and development, yet economic development is slow at best, backwards at worst, and things need to change. When these kind of questions are presented to me, I always think, okay, I'm in favor of change, I'm in favor of reform, but the question I always want to start with is who needs to change? Is it us? Is it me as the mayor? Is it the city of Syracuse? Is it Onondaga County? Is it the state? So with that in mind, I thought I would give you a couple of examples of what's going on in other places in the state. And the city of Albany this year announced that they have a $12.5 million deficit that New York State had to fill in the budget with a special line for Albany. And without that $12.5 million, Albany would be insolvent. But this is not just this year that they have to do it. This is a recurring deficit every year that Albany, the city of Albany, has. In the city of Rochester, the Rochester reporter Rachel Barnard has said, we still have more than 40,000 fewer people employed than we did in the 90s here in the Rochester area, 40,000 fewer people in the workforce, 40,000 fewer people that have jobs, so how can you be so bright about what's happening? I deliberately have taken third-party sources for the slides that I'm going to show you so that you understand that this is not just me creating these, this is coming from other places. In the city of Buffalo, they have a outlet called the Investigative Post, which did a, quote, real state of the city and looked at job growth and the state of the city of Buffalo and found that Buffalo is a ward of the state and will continue to be a ward of the state for the growing future. At the same time as I was doing some research on this, I found that the Erie County executive put up a Facebook post, which I thought was kind of telling. And in the Facebook post he said, I want to thank you to the members of the Amherst IDA who voted against giving additional tax breaks for a hotel project. They did the right thing by rejecting the view of developers that they are entitled to a tax break. No one is entitled to a tax break, especially on a project that does not create new net economic benefit to the community. Great job and thanks for rejecting corporate handouts that benefit no one but the developers. Also, keep in mind that 1 out of every 2 children born into the city of Syracuse, the city of Rochester, and the city of Buffalo are born into poverty. And given what we know about economic mobility and the studies that are being done, unless things change dramatically, they will die in poverty. Cornell professor Mildred Warner has done a lot of studies on older industrial cities in New York State in particular. And this is from a presentation that she gave. And what you see there is New York City and Ithaca up at the top doing very well. And then everybody else, there you have the US average and the New York average, everybody below that line. So this is clearly not a leadership issue. This isn't that the city of Binghamton has a worse mayor and legislature than the city of Syracuse or Rochester. This isn't really a statewide issue. These are good people and leaders in systems that need reform. As we said, things need to change. So what needs to change? Well, when you look at this, what you can see very handily is that all of these cities are subject to the same rigid systems that are getting in the way of economic development. And what are those systems? One of them is unfunded mandates. And what happens in New York State with unfunded mandates? Well, again, this is Mildred Warner from Cornell, who shows that New York State pushes down the vast number of costs down to local governments. In fact, it's second in the United States. So when those of us rail against unfunded mandates, turns out that we actually are talking about something very accurate. That most of what New York State is doing is pushing it down to the local level and saying you must pay for this and you figure out how to pay for it. So if this is a statewide issue, which it clearly is, I think, then what are the statewide solutions for economic development? Well, we have all seen the ubiquitous Startup New York television commercials. And on April 1st of this year, I guess that was 2 weeks ago, the New York State was supposed to publish a progress report to show us how many jobs Startup New York had published. New York State has failed to meet that deadline and has said that they're going to, but they continue not to meet that deadline, and this is something that they have done repeatedly. Yet, that being said, there have been newspaper stories that have looked into it themselves and looked at the data. And there was a newspaper story 2 months ago that showed that there were 150 companies enrolled in the program that pledged 4,000 jobs over the next 5 years. Again, it's from a newspaper story. Pledged 4,000 jobs, 150 companies. There's been $207 million over 3 years spent on ads for Startup New York, and also including the I Love New York ad. $207 million for roughly 150 companies for pledging 4,000 jobs. That math doesn't work for us, for me. Well, so that's what's going on sort of at the statewide level. Well, let's talk about the local approach to economic development. Our local approach to economic development has always been, at least from my memory as an elected official, giving tax breaks to developers to generate economic activity. And the idea being that if you do that, it will stimulate growth. And the primary tool that we use to do that are what's called industrial development authorities. So what is an IDA, an industrial development authority? It is a public benefit corporation, so it's a quasi-governmental entity, established under New York State for the benefit of a municipality and its residents. And in general, an IDA is governed by a board of 3 to 7 members appointed by a governing body of the municipality for which the IDA was established. And what does the IDA do? The IDA has the power to exempt property taxes, state and local sales tax, and mortgage recording tax. And why is this important? Because property taxes are the primary source of revenue for local governments. And this is particularly important in places like the city of Syracuse and also Rochester and the city of Buffalo, because we have such a high proportion of our land that is nonprofit. 50% of our land is off the tax rolls. So the 50% that is on the tax rolls, if you start cutting into that, you're really cutting into the bone. It's also important because over and over again, we have been told that the primary burden or obstacle to development in upstate New York is onerous property taxes. So these are very powerful entities that have a lot of power and can also have a lot of impact, both positive and detrimental. As a part of this power that they have, the comptroller every 2 years has an annual report on IDAs, in which the comptroller goes through IDAs and looks at their performance. The comptroller has found that since 2009, there has been a huge shift in the distribution of projects in New York State. There are fewer IDA projects in manufacturing, wholesale trade, and transportation, and there are more projects in services, construction, finance, insurance, and real estate. In addition to which, the comptroller was successful in pushing the prohibition about assisting retail projects through IDAs. Through a number of economic studies and convincing the legislature, which went back and forth about whether IDAs should be able to assist retail projects. Finally, New York State said, no, IDAs should not be able to, for 2 reasons. The first is retail projects do not increase the level of jobs available in a region or economic activity. Often the related gains come at the expense of other retail enterprises in the area. Think about our experience. Destiny opens, Shoppingtown closes. Great Northern Mall, Penn Mall, Town Center opens, those others. So there is an impact that we know firsthand, subjectively, that cannibalizes these malls. The second and equally important finding is that the retail jobs pay significantly less than manufacturing and professional jobs. So they should not be given these kind of lucrative tax benefits. That goes into law, and then what happens? Well, then there is a major push forward where projects are starting to be miscoded. So projects that are traditional retail projects are now no longer coded as retail projects. As an example, our Destiny Mall. That is not coded as a retail project. Now, if the Destiny Mall is not a retail project, I'm not sure what it is. And in fact, the Destiny Carousel project, for the purposes of the IDA, is categorized as wholesale trade. Those of you who live on the western side of the county, the Town Center 5 in Camillus project, that is also not coded as a retail project. Although if you look at that, I think any of us would say, well, looks like a duck, smells like a duck, it's a retail project, it's restaurants, and it's a Costco. But it is coded as tourism, as a tourism attraction, because people are going to travel to go to the Costco. This is what's happening in terms of economic development, so that you can stimulate growth, or the idea of growth, with new projects, and you can stand in front of them or cut ribbons and say, look, it's great. And then but don't look at the details of it. This IDA report says, and what we should all do, and what we all say that we are doing, is that incentives should be coupled with performance. That's where we are in the midst of right now, having a very vigorous debate on the discussion of community benefits. Because for far too long, I think that this community has, the leadership of this community has used the economic development philosophy of any economic development is good economic development. And I don't think that that is accurate. So, as my friend Mike Bloomberg said, trust in God and everyone else bring data. So, we actually happen to have the data to analyze this with the project known as Destiny. So there are two major components that you are supposed to give IDA benefits for. It's supposed to stimulate economic activity, or supposed to stimulate job growth. And now I just want to reflect for a second on the idea of sales tax, why we hear so much about sales tax in our community, and why it is, relatively speaking, so important. We are focused on sales tax because it's the only revenue for government that grows. Property taxes remain flat because of our lack of growth. State and federal monies have declined every single year that I have been in office. Yet our costs of salaries and health care and pensions, which I have talked to you about numerous times, continue to increase. So when you are a leader looking at these costs that continue to increase in flat revenue, but you see one that you say, well, I can goose that revenue, and that will help me, thus the focus on sales tax. And I know many of you remember, but for the benefit of all of us, that the Destiny project came in front of this community, and the Destiny developers promised that there was going to be a windfall in sales tax that would overcome the property tax losses. It's part of what they said, and the job creation. So I want to talk about what we know based on the current assessment, what we have given up. So it totals $19.6 million a year. The city school district loses $8.7 million a year every year for 30 years. Now, I want to also call attention to this. These are the poorest children in our community who are giving this up. That's the nature of how pilot agreements work, because the single largest piece of our property taxes is actually our school taxes. So these are the most vulnerable and the neediest people in our community who are giving up the most. Then you see the city of Syracuse and the county and water fees, and we put that all together for a total of $500 million, or just over $500 million over 30 years. Now, the sales tax growth that we have seen. In 2012, that was when the Destiny expansion was done. Accordingly, in 2012, we should have seen at least $19 million more in sales tax. We did not. In 2012 to 2013, the sales tax numbers were $76 million. The next year, we got $78 million in sales tax, so $2 million more. Now let me just, could you go back to the slide, Joel, for a second? Go back to the other one. Now you'll see here there's a huge jump there between 2005 and 2006. That jump isn't because of economic activity. That jump is because that is the year that when we raised and I use the colloquial we, when we raised the sales tax 1%, that is when it went into effect. So I just want to be clear here, that is not economic activity, that you see that huge jump in sales tax. So we should have seen an additional $20 million between 2013 and 2014. We did not. We saw an additional $2 million. Now, this is a rough comparison for a couple of reasons. The first is that we cannot figure out sales tax revenue by location alone. It is aggregated. That means that the Old Navy and Destiny Mall and on Erie Boulevard and in Camillus, they send their sales tax money into the state for Onondaga County. So we can't tell, geez, is Destiny producing all of this additional revenue or is it someplace else? But this is revenue that the state and the comptroller follows maniacally for us, and that we follow because it's one of our major, it's rapidly becoming our primary source of revenue. Let's look at the other part of this, the jobs analysis for Destiny. Now you'll all remember, of course, that Destiny promised $60,000 a year jobs. Now, Destiny has said that they have created 5,500 jobs. With 5,500 jobs, if you pay them $15 an hour for 2,000 hours, that's $30,000 a year. If you pay them $9 an hour at 2,000 hours, that's $18,000 a year. Well, guess what? Lo and behold, New York State, through the Department of Labor, keeps track of all these numbers. It's amazing what a nerd can do when she has a couple of hours to herself. The New York State Department of Labor keeps track of these statistics, and that's the code that you use, and it's all online, and they're done regularly. And the New York State Department of Labor says, in central New York, which includes Onondaga County, obviously, the entry-level position for a retail salesperson is $18,900. That is just above $9 an hour. The median is $21,700. Again, still below $15 an hour. Well, then let's do the math. So if we lose every year $19.6 million a year in sales tax, and then you divide that by the cost of 5,500 jobs, we are paying $3,563 a year per job to Destiny. That doesn't even count the subsidizing benefits of food stamps and health care, because if you have a child or you are working full-time, you can't live on those wages here. Now, let me then say about this part of it. So, subjectively, those of us in the city who went through this felt like it wasn't a good deal for us. And now, objectively, we have gone through the data and we've said this was not a good transaction. From a sales tax perspective, from a job creation perspective, it doesn't work. The Destiny developers come to the city and say they're going to build a hotel associated with it. This is the hotel that they promised us to get the 30-year benefit. You remember that. Leaves of Grass, $450 million hotel, 39 stories, largest building outside of New York City. Nothing like it in the world. The accuracy there, of course, is in the word nothing. Nothing was built, yet they got a 30-year tax break, and this was part of what they promised to build. They came to us in 16 with a new hotel proposal, and we said, no, not going to do it. Objectively, subjectively, doesn't make sense for us. And so what they did is they went to the county And then the county gave them a tax break to build that. The county's IDA for a 7-story hotel with approximately $7 million in tax exemptions, the largest portion of which will take money away from our school children. So that's where we are in economic development. That we have set up a system where we are racing to the bottom. And even when you have the data to say, we don't want to do this based on the data, and even when you have the subjective sense, we don't want to do this, we have this overwhelming sense that any economic activity is good economic activity. I have been asked frequently in the last 6 months to try to explain the wave of populism that is rushing across our country and even here, and the things that are said and the kind of energy that is gotten behind some of the presidential candidates. When you are in a position where you are seeing things like this happen, and when you challenge the status quo, and then everybody lines up against you to say, no, you shouldn't, because any economic activity is good economic activity, you start to understand firsthand why it resonates when people say the game is rigged. You start to understand firsthand why people aren't satisfied with the typical kind of answers that politicians and elected officials are giving. And you start to understand firsthand why when you represent the poorest people in the country, and yet over and over the richest people in the community are getting the biggest tax breaks, that it starts to stick in the craw of a lot of people who've said, this isn't acceptable, and we're not going to just say any economic activity is good economic activity and stand by and let this happen. So, as I started, I told you about, I have a number of favorite Mike Bloomberg quotes, a number of which are not appropriate for work. But this is one that I think about a lot. What you've got to do is be honest, say what you believe, give it to them straight, and just don't wuss out. And I will tell you, on behalf of the people of the city of Syracuse, we don't wuss out. And we're going to continue to say it straight, whether we win, whether we lose, because some battles are just worth having. Thank you.